And in today's lesson, we are going to look at the second part of Chapter 7, Lesson 1, and look at some interesting reproductive cycles of a couple different organisms. I want to point out up here that several aquatic invertebrates, like sponges, cnidarians, have life cycles that alternate between asexual and sexual reproduction. So in the last lesson, we talked about the difference between asexual reproduction requiring just one parent and sexual reproduction requiring two. Some of these organisms are able to sort of switch between and alternate between types of asexual and types of sexual reproduction. So the first one I'm going to look at is the sponge. That's what this diagram is showing you here on page 248, and that a sponge reproduces both asexually and sexually. So it reproduces asexually through budding. And if you remember yesterday, in last lesson, we talked about budding being where a new offspring will basically form off of the body of the parent and then detach itself and begin to develop and grow on its own. So small new sponges will grow or bud from the sides of an adult sponge, and eventually they break free and begin life on their own. But they also reproduce sexually, but they don't have separate sexes or separate genders. A sponge is one of those organisms that can produce both sperm cells and egg cells. A larva is what develops, and a larva is just an immature form of an animal that looks very different from the adult. And as we talk about different organisms as we go through these different chapters, the larval stage, or a larva, is just a form of the animal. It's the immature, it's the young form, but it looks nothing like what the adult looks like or what it's going to become. So as we look at the life cycle here of the sponge, you see that the adult sponge releases the sperm. Those cells then will enter into another sponge and fertilize the egg. That fertilized egg then becomes a larva. The larva gets carried away, so you can see this larva looks nothing like the adult sponge. The larva gets carried away, it settles down onto a surface and then develops into an adult sponge on its own. So this is sort of the life cycle of a sponge. And then you can see up here where there is a new sponge that is budding off of the adult sponge. And then again, they release the sperm goes into another sponge, fertilize the egg, it becomes a larva gets released, it settles somewhere, and the cycle just continues on and on. So that is the reproductive cycle of a sponge. Now we're going to look at cnidarians. And cnidarians are many of which, it's a special group, alternate between two different body forms. So as we look at this in a second, so as I talk through this, they've got these divided on two separate pages. So as I discuss and talk about this section in the text on page 248, you can watch here, but in your book, kind of be watching also on page 249 and compare that diagram as I go through this. So the polyp form of the cnidarian is the stage that kind of looks like an upright vase. So if you look on page 249, the form of the cnidarian, and this is a jellyfish, on the bottom that kind of looks like a vase with those little tentacles, that would be the polyp stage. The medusa stage looks kind of like an open umbrella. So those sections there where they look like an umbrella that's either upside down or right side up, that is the medusa stage. Some of these polyps reproduce asexually by budding. Again, they just grow off of the parent and then they separate and pull apart onto their own. So those polyps then pull apart, form 2 new polyps. This is a way that they can really rapidly increase the number of offspring that they have. During the Medusa stage, the Cnidarians reproduce sexually. They release the sperm and the eggs into the water. The fertilized egg then develops into larva. In turn, that larva attaches to a hard surface, develops into a polyp that then continues the life cycle. So let me now catch up with you on that page. As we look at this. So here we have the adult jellyfish or cnidarian that reproduces sexually by releasing the sperm into the water, which then fertilizes the egg cell. That fertilized egg cell then develops into a larva. Again, notice that the larva looks nothing like either form of the adult jellyfish. That larva then goes down and attaches itself to a hard surface and develops into what we call the polyp. Remember, the polyp stage is the stage that kind of looks like an upright vase. Notice over time how a bunch of these new little polyps have formed through budding on the adult polyp. Those then get released, and this mature stage, where they look like umbrellas, are called the Medusa stage. Each of those will then continue to grow and develop into the adult jellyfish that then repeats the cycle again. All right, so when it comes to the sexual reproduction, fertilization can happen a couple different ways. You can have external fertilization or internal fertilization. And in external fertilization, it's exactly what it says. It occurs outside of the female's body. Internal fertilization occurs inside the female body. So for example, many fishes, amphibians, aquatic invertebrates, fertilization occurs outside of the body. And that's what you see in the bottom here. There are eggs that have already been laid by another female fish or another fish. And then this fish comes along and then sort of releases this cloud that contains the sperm cells that will then fertilize the eggs outside of the body. During external fertilization, generally, it must take place in water. This prevents the eggs and the sperm from drying out. So first the female releases the eggs into the water, then the male releases the sperm nearby, and then the eggs get fertilized, and then they develop into the new offspring. But it's important that it takes place in water so that they don't dry out. And then internal fertilization that occurs inside the body. The male releases the sperm directly into the female's body where the eggs are located. From there, a couple of different things can happen. Most invertebrates and many fishes, amphibians, reptiles, and birds lay eggs outside the parent's body. So the egg gets fertilized, but then the egg leaves the female's body, and the offspring continue to develop inside of the egg. Think about chickens, ducks, snakes, where there are eggs that are fertilized inside the body, but then the egg is released and the young and the offspring continue to develop inside of that egg. However, for other animals, including most mammals, the egg develops inside the female. And then the female gives birth to live young. So this is what we think about in humans. Once the egg is fertilized, the egg stays inside the female, develops, and then the offspring is born live. The length of time between fertilization and birth is what we call the gestation period. The gestation period. And they just give you a couple examples here. Opossums have the very shortest gestation period, only about 13 days. So once the egg is fertilized, it only takes about 13 days before the offspring are born. African elephants have the longest gestation period, up to 22 months. So once the egg is fertilized, it stays inside the mother's body for almost 2 years before it is born. So, the size of the animal has something to do with it. It also has to be that the offspring is going to have to be developed enough inside of the mother so that it can sort of stand and take care of itself when it's born. So if you think about, zebras in the wild, once they're born, they have to be able to walk because there will be predators out there that are trying to get it. And if they are helpless, then they will not be able to survive. So, horses, zebras, gazelle, deer, those types of things, they need to be able to get up and move as soon as they're born. So they need to stay in the body for a much longer time in order to develop to that stage. Alrighty, that completes lesson 1 of chapter 7. Thanks for listening. See you next time.